Naomi Carter had spent 2 years serving plates she could never afford to eat from. She kept her head down, her voice soft, and her dignity locked somewhere behind her ribs where no one could touch it. But tonight, the man at the corner table, the one who never smiled, never spoke more than 6 words, called her upstairs to a private office and slid a marriage contract across the table. "I won't stop until you give me a baby," he said. If she refused, her mother would lose everything. He had made sure of that. The fluorescent light above the kitchen sink had been flickering for 11 days. Naomi noticed it every morning at 5:15 when she stood in the narrow galley of their Brooklyn apartment, packing her mother's medications into the weekly organizer. 7 pills before breakfast, 4 after lunch, 2 before sleep. She had memorized the colors the way other women memorized lipstick shades. Her mother, Ruth Carter, sat in the recliner by the window, a blanket pulled up to her chest, even though it was August in New York. The dialysis sessions had thinned her out, turned her dark skin ashy, made her hands tremble when she reached for her coffee. But Ruth still insisted on making her own coffee every morning, even when it took her 10 minutes to cross the kitchen. "You're going to be late," Ruth said without turning around. "I'm never late," Naomi answered. She zipped the pill organizer shut and placed it on the counter next to the stove. "There's soup in the fridge. Don't skip lunch again." Ruth waved a hand like she was shooing a fly. "Go take care of rich people's appetites. I'll take care of mine." Naomi grabbed her coat and left without another word. That was their language, short, practical, built on the understanding that tenderness was a luxury neither of them could afford right now. Lucielle sat on the 42nd floor of a glass tower in Midtown, the kind of restaurant where a single appetizer cost more than Naomi's daily wage. She had worked there for 2 years, long enough to learn that wealthy people tipped better when you were invisible, so she made herself invisible. She refilled glasses before they were empty. She cleared plates without sound. She smiled exactly enough to be polite and not a fraction more. The regulars barely registered her face. She was background noise, a moving piece of furniture with dark skin and a pressed white shirt. All except one. Adrian Vale always sat at the corner table by the window, the one with the unobstructed view of Central Park. He came in 3 times a week, always alone, always ordering the same thing, black coffee first, then whatever the chef recommended, no substitutions. He never looked at the menu. He never looked at anyone, really. His eyes stayed fixed on his phone or on the skyline, as though the people around him were beneath his attention. He was 38. Naomi knew this because the hostess had whispered it to her once, along with other details she hadn't asked for. CEO of Vale Industries, net worth somewhere in the billions, never married, never photographed with the same woman twice. "Cold as a glacier," the hostess had said, but God, what a glacier. Naomi didn't care about glaciers. She cared about the $67,000 her mother owed Columbia Presbyterian, a number that grew every month like something alive and hungry. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. She found it in the mailbox after her morning shift, a thin white envelope with the logo of a financial group she had never heard of. Inside, a single page informed her that the hospital had sold her mother's outstanding debt to Kessler Capital Partners. The remaining balance, now $89,400 after accumulated interest, late fees, and transfer charges, was due within 30 days. $22,000 had been added to a debt her mother never had a chance to pay in the first place. Naomi read the letter twice. Then she folded it, put it back in the envelope, and slid it into the bottom of her bag, where her mother would never find it. 30 days. She made $2,000 a month after rent. The math wasn't complicated. It was impossible. That same evening, her manager, a thin man named Gregory with a smile that never reached his eyes, pulled her aside before her shift. "Table 12 complained about you last night," Gregory said, adjusting his cufflinks. "Said you were cold, unfriendly." "I brought their food on time and refilled their water 3 times, Naomi said. "This isn't a cafeteria. People pay for an experience here. They want warmth. They want to feel special." Gregory leaned closer. "I'm giving you a warning. One more complaint, and we'll have to make changes." Naomi nodded. She didn't argue. She had learned a long time ago that arguing with men like Gregory only gave them permission to punish you for having a voice. She worked her shift in silence, moving between tables like a shadow, pouring wine and clearing dishes, and pretending that the letter in her bag wasn't burning a hole through the fabric. At 9:45, as the dining room began to thin out, Gregory appeared beside her again. "The gentleman at the corner table wants to see you," he said. "Upstairs. Private dining room." Naomi looked across the restaurant. Adrian Vale sat in his usual spot, but tonight he wasn't looking at his phone. He was looking at her. Not the way most men looked at her, not with hunger or curiosity or casual dismissal. He looked at her the way a chess player looks at the board before making a decisive move. "Why does he want to see me?" Naomi asked. Gregory shrugged. "He's our biggest client. If he wants to see the janitor, we send the janitor. Go." The private dining room on the top floor was smaller than Naomi expected. A single table, 2 chairs, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Adrian stood by the window with his back to her, his hands in his pockets, his reflection sharp against the glass. "Sit down, Miss Carter," he said without turning around. The fact that he knew her name made something tighten in her chest. She didn't sit. "I'd rather stand," she said. "What is this about?" Adrian turned. Up close, he looked exactly like what he was, a man who had been in control of everything around him for so long that the idea of resistance was almost exotic to him. His suit probably cost more than her rent. His watch definitely did. He reached into his jacket and produced a folder. He set it on the table and opened it. Inside was a copy of the letter from Kessler Capital Partners, the same letter sitting at the bottom of her bag. "I own Kessler Capital," Adrian said. "Which means I own your mother's debt. $89,400, due in 30 days. Naomi felt the floor shift beneath her, but she didn't let it show on her face. She had years of practice at that. "What do you want?" she asked. Adrian sat down across from her. He folded his hands on the table, long fingers, no ring, no warmth. "I need a wife," he said. "A real one. Legal, documented, verifiable. And I need an heir within 2 years." The words hung in the air like smoke. "My father's will contains a provision." Adrian continued, his voice as flat as if he were reading a quarterly earnings report. "If I don't produce a legitimate heir through a legal marriage within the next 24 months, controlling interest in Vale Industries transfers to my half-brother. The board has the authority to investigate the authenticity of the marriage. It has to be real." Naomi stared at him. "And you chose a waitress." "I chose carefully," Adrian corrected. "Someone outside my social circle. Someone with no prior connections to anyone on the board or in the press. Someone who wouldn't be recognized at galas or traced back to business rivals." He held her gaze. "And someone who has a very strong reason to say yes." There it was, the trap laid out with surgical precision. "You're blackmailing me," Naomi said. "I'm offering you a transaction," Adrian replied. 2 years, 1 child. In exchange, I clear your mother's debt entirely. I cover every medical expense, including the kidney transplant she needs. I provide housing security and a financial settlement when the contract ends. He leaned forward slightly. "Your mother lives. Your family is safe. All I need is your signature. I won't stop until you give me a baby." He added quieter now, as though saying it softer somehow made it less monstrous. "That's the terms." Naomi's hands were shaking under the table. She pressed them flat against her thighs and forced herself to breathe. She thought about her mother sitting in that recliner, the blanket pulled up to her chest in August. She thought about the pill organizer on the counter. She thought about $89,000 and 30 days and the flickering fluorescent light she couldn't afford to replace. Then she looked Adrian Vale directly in the eye, the way she always did, the way the hostess and the busboys and every other server at Le Ciel never dared to, and said, "If I agree, I have conditions." Something shifted behind Adrian's expression. Not surprise, exactly. More like recognition, as though he had expected her to crumble and was recalibrating now that she hadn't. "Name them," he said. "First, this marriage is real. You treat me as your wife in public and in private. I'm not a servant in your house. Second, you never contact, threaten, or interfere with my mother. She's off limits. Third, if you break any part of this agreement, I walk. And I keep every benefit you've promised." Adrian studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded once. "Agreed." He slid a pen across the table. Naomi picked it up. Her hand was steady now. She signed the contract at the bottom of the last page, set the pen down, and stood. "One more thing," she said from the doorway. "I'm doing this for my mother, not for you. Don't ever confuse the two." She walked out without waiting for a response. Behind her, Adrian Vale sat alone at the table, looking at her signature on the page. For the first time in years, he had the uncomfortable feeling that he had just entered into a deal where he might not hold all the leverage. The wedding took place on a Thursday afternoon in a courthouse downtown. No flowers, no guests, no music. Just a judge, 2 witnesses provided by Adrian's legal team, and a marriage certificate that felt heavier in Naomi's hands than any serving tray she had ever carried. Adrian wore a dark suit, the same kind he wore every day. Naomi wore a white blouse she had ironed 3 times that morning in the apartment, while her mother slept in the next room, unaware that her daughter was about to marry a stranger. She hadn't told Ruth. She couldn't. Not yet. She had said she got a new job, an administrative position at a private company, better pay, better hours. Ruth had looked at her with the quiet suspicion of a woman who had raised a daughter alone for 26 years and could smell a lie the way dogs smell fear. But she hadn't pushed. That was their way. Within a week, Naomi moved into the Vale estate, a limestone mansion on the Upper East Side with more rooms than she could count, and a silence so thick it pressed against her eardrums. Her clothes occupied a fraction of the walk-in closet in the master suite. Adrian slept in a separate bedroom down the hall. They shared meals at a dining table long enough to seat 14, sitting at opposite ends like diplomats from hostile nations. Adrian spoke to her the way he spoke to his assistant, polite, efficient, empty. He asked if she needed anything. He told her the housekeeper would handle the shopping. He informed her that a stylist would arrive on Friday to prepare her wardrobe for public appearances. "I don't need a stylist," Naomi said on her 3rd morning in the house, standing in the kitchen doorway with a cup of coffee she had made herself because the espresso machine was the only thing in this mansion that didn't make her feel like a guest. "You need to look like my wife," Adrian replied without looking up from his laptop. "The board is already watching." It took exactly 12 days for the press to find her. The headline in the New York Post read, "Vale's Cinderella billionaire tech CEO marries waitress from Midtown restaurant." The tabloids were less generous. One gossip site ran her employee photo from Le Ciel next to a picture of Adrian at a gala with the caption, "From serving tables to sleeping in mansions, how far will a pretty face take you?" The comments were worse. Naomi made the mistake of reading them once on her phone in the bathroom with the door locked and never opened them again. Adrian's family responded with the quiet cruelty of people who had mastered the art of disapproval without ever raising their voices. His stepmother, a woman named Vivian, who wore pearls like armor, visited the estate on the 2nd week and spent the entire lunch referring to Naomi as Adrian's friend, never once using the word wife. And then there was Dominic. Adrian's half-brother was 32, handsome in a sharper, hungrier way than Adrian, with the kind of smile that promised you something and took it away at the same time. He showed up unannounced one evening while Adrian was at the office leaning against the doorframe of the living room like he owned the place, which if things went his way, he soon would. "So you're the one," Dominic said, looking Naomi up and down with open amusement. "I have to admit I didn't see this coming." Adrian usually has better taste in business decisions. Naomi set down the book she had been reading. Is there something you need? Just curious. Dominic walked into the room uninvited and sat across from her. A waitress? No family money? No connections? No degree from anywhere anyone's heard of? He tilted his head. What exactly do you bring to this arrangement? Naomi met his eyes. I bring the ability to recognize a man trying to intimidate me in my own living room, and I bring the good sense not to be impressed by it. Dominic's smile didn't waver, but something behind it hardened. He left without another word. That night, Naomi heard Adrian on the phone in his study, his voice low and controlled. Keep him away from the house. I don't care how you do it. It was the first time he had done anything that resembled protecting her. The charity gala came 6 weeks into the marriage. A black tie event at the Metropolitan Club, 300 guests, crystal chandeliers, and enough diamonds in the room to fund her mother's transplant 10 times over. Naomi wore a deep green dress the stylist had chosen. It fit perfectly, which somehow made it feel less like hers. Adrian walked beside her with his hand on the small of her back, a gesture for the cameras, nothing more. They moved through the room like a photograph composed beautiful hollow. At dinner, they were seated next to a silver-haired hedge fund manager named Lowell, who had been drinking since the cocktail hour and had apparently decided that Naomi was his entertainment for the evening. So, Mrs. Vale, Lowell said, swirling his wine with the lazy confidence of a man who had never been told no. I hear you used to work at Le Ciel, wonderful restaurant. Tell me what's the proper way to hold a dessert fork, I always forget. The table went quiet. 7 pairs of eyes turned toward Naomi. Adrian's hand resting on the table beside his glass went still. Naomi looked at Lowell with the same calm expression she had perfected over 2 years of serving people exactly like him. The dessert fork is the small one on the outside, she said. But given how much wine you've had tonight, Mr. Lowell, I'd recommend skipping the fork entirely and asking someone to spoon-feed you. It would be safer for everyone. Laughter rippled across the table, surprised, genuine laughter from people who were not used to being surprised. Lowell's face reddened. He reached for his wine glass and said nothing for the rest of the evening. Adrian didn't laugh. But when Naomi glanced at him, she caught something she had never seen on his face before, a flicker of admiration that he extinguished almost immediately, like a man snuffing out a candle he hadn't meant to light. He didn't mention it on the ride home. But the next morning, for the first time, he poured her coffee before pouring his own. 2 months in, Ruth's condition worsened. Her kidneys were failing faster than the doctors had projected. The transplant couldn't wait another 6 months. They needed to move her up the list, which meant transferring her to a specialized facility with a dedicated nephrology team. Adrian arranged it within 48 hours. New hospital, private room, the best nephrologist on the East Coast. He did it without being asked, and he did it without mentioning it to Naomi. She found out from the hospital directly when they called to confirm the transfer. She didn't thank him. She wasn't sure whether the gesture came from something real or whether it was just maintenance, protecting his investment, keeping the terms of the contract intact. Then came the night Ruth collapsed. It was 11:30 on a Wednesday. Naomi's phone rang, the night nurse at the facility voice, tight with professional urgency. Ruth had gone into cardiac distress during dialysis. They had stabilized her, but she needed to come now. Naomi got dressed in the dark. She didn't wake Adrian. She didn't call his driver. She took the subway, the same subway she had taken every day for 2 years, to get to Le Ciel, and sat in a plastic seat under fluorescent lights that buzzed the same way the light above her old kitchen sink used to buzz, and she pressed her hands together in her lap and held herself still. At the hospital, Ruth was asleep, connected to monitors that beeped in steady rhythm. The doctor said the episode had passed, stable for now, but the transplant had become urgent. Naomi sat in the hallway outside her mother's room, back against the wall, knees drawn up. Her eyes were red but dry. She had stopped crying about her mother's illness a long time ago, not because she didn't feel it, but because crying took energy she couldn't spare. Adrian found her there at 6 in the morning. She didn't know how he had known. He stood at the end of the hallway in a coat thrown over what looked like the clothes he had slept in, which meant he probably hadn't slept at all. He walked toward her, and she expected him to ask about the medical details or to remind her that her mother's treatment was covered under their agreement. Instead, he sat down on the floor beside her. He didn't say a word. He just sat there, shoulder almost touching hers in a hospital hallway that smelled like antiseptic and recycled air, and for 5 minutes they existed in the same silence. It was the first time Adrian had ever done something without a reason. Or at least without a reason he could explain to a boardroom. Naomi didn't know what to do with that, so she filed it away and moved on. 3 weeks later, she found the files. Adrian had left his study unlocked, an unusual lapse for a man who controlled every variable in his life. Naomi had gone in to retrieve a book she'd left on his desk, and there in a drawer that hadn't been fully closed, she found a manila folder with her name on it. Inside was everything. Her medical records from 3 years ago. A genetic screening she had never consented to somehow obtained through her mother's hospital. Financial statements going back 5 years. Employment history. A background check that included interviews with her former landlord, 2 ex-co-workers, and her college roommate. And at the bottom, a 1-page evaluation marked confidential with a header that read, Candidate Profile Surrogate Assessment. Her hands didn't shake this time. Something colder than fear moved through her, a hard, clear anger that settled in her chest like a stone. She found Adrian in the dining room eating breakfast as though the world were operating exactly as he had designed it. She dropped the folder on the table in front of him. His coffee cup rattled against the saucer. "You knew everything about me before we ever spoke," Naomi said. Her voice was level-controlled and entirely without warmth. "My blood type, my family history, whether I was genetically likely to carry a healthy pregnancy." Adrian looked at the folder, then at her. For once, he didn't have a prepared response. "You don't need a wife," Naomi said. "You need a womb." The words landed like a blade. Adrian's face didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted, a crack in the architecture, thin but unmistakable. She had named the thing he had refused to name, and now it sat between them on the dining table next to his coffee and his perfectly arranged breakfast, ugly and undeniable. He was his father. He had built an elaborate machine to produce an heir, and he had selected the most efficient component he could find. The fact that the component was a woman with a name and a mother and a life she had been fighting to hold together that had been irrelevant to the equation. Until now. Naomi didn't wait for an answer. She turned and walked out of the dining room. Adrian sat alone with the open folder and the cold knowledge that the woman he had chosen precisely because she wouldn't fight back had just shown him exactly who he was. The fallout came fast. Dominic had been digging for months, and he finally found what he needed. Not proof of a fake marriage, but something almost as damaging. Through a contact at Adrian's legal firm, he obtained enough details to construct a story that Adrian Vale had engineered a contractual marriage specifically to produce an heir and satisfy the terms of his father's will. The story broke on a Friday morning. By noon, Vale Industries stock had dropped 9%. By evening, the board of directors had called an emergency session. 3 members publicly demanded Adrian's resignation. Cable news ran the headline on a loop, "Billion-dollar baby deal inside the Vale marriage contract." Adrian spent the weekend in damage control, locked in conference calls with lawyers and PR consultants. He barely spoke to Naomi, and when he did, it was in the clipped mechanical tone of a man whose walls had gone back up twice as thick. But the worst blow came from inside the apartment across the bridge in Brooklyn, where Ruth Carter sat watching the news on a small television screen and saw her daughter's face next to a headline she had to read 3 times before she believed it. Ruth called Naomi that Saturday evening. Her voice was quiet, not the quiet of weakness, but the quiet that comes before something breaks. "Is it true?" Ruth asked. "Did you marry that man because of my hospital bills?" Naomi closed her eyes. She had prepared for this conversation 100 times in her head, and every version had been a lie. She was tired of lying. "Yes," she said. The line went silent for a long time. When Ruth spoke again, her voice was steady and final. "I would rather die on that dialysis machine than watch my daughter sell her life to pay for mine. I'm refusing the transplant, and I want you to leave that house." Naomi tried to speak, but Ruth had already hung up. That night alone in the master bedroom of a mansion that had never felt like home, Naomi sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the pregnancy test in her hand. 2 lines. Unmistakable. She was carrying Adrian Vale's child. She sat with that knowledge for a long time, turning it over the way she had once turned over the letter from Kessler Capital, reading it, rereading it, searching for a version of reality where the math worked out in her favor. The math didn't work. It never had. But for the first time since she signed that contract, Naomi made a decision that wasn't about survival. It was about something she refused to let go of even now, especially now. She packed one bag. She left the designer clothes in the closet, the jewelry in the velvet-lined box on the dresser, the credit cards on the nightstand. She placed her wedding ring on the dining table, the same table where she had dropped the folder, the same table where Adrian ate his perfectly arranged breakfasts alone. Next to the ring, she left a note. One sentence written in the careful handwriting of a woman who had spent her whole life being precise, because precision was the only power she had. "I will not let my child grow up inside a contract." She walked out of the Vale estate at 4 in the morning, carrying nothing but a single bag and the life growing inside her. Within a week, the board voted to remove Adrian from his position as CEO. Dominic assumed interim control of Vale Industries. The press called it a coup. The financial analysts called it inevitable. Adrian stood in the empty dining room of his mansion looking at the ring on the table and the note beside it, and felt something he hadn't felt since he was 12 years old, and his father had told him that love was a liability that smart men didn't carry. He felt alone. Not the productive solitude he had cultivated for decades, the kind that made him efficient, focused, untouchable. This was different. This was the silence of a man who had spent his entire life acquiring things and had never once considered that the most important things couldn't be acquired. He had the house. He had the money. He had the name. He didn't have her. For 3 days after Naomi left, Adrian did nothing. He sat in his study with the door closed and the curtains drawn, surrounded by the machinery of a life that had stopped functioning. His phone lit up constantly, lawyers, board members, journalists, Dominic's people circling like vultures. He let every call go to voicemail. The housekeeper left meals outside the door. He didn't touch them. On the 4th day, he opened the drawer of his desk and took out the manila folder, the one Naomi had dropped on the dining table, the one he had picked up off the floor after she walked out. He read through it again. Every page. The medical records, the genetic screening, the background check, the one-page evaluation with the clinical header, Candidate Profile Surrogate Assessment. He had written this. Not literally his team had compiled it, but he had commissioned it, reviewed it, approved it. He had looked at these pages and seen data, probability, efficiency. He had looked at a woman's entire life reduced to metrics on a spreadsheet and thought this will work. His father had done the same thing to his mother. Adrian had spent 30 years hating him for it. And then he had done it anyway, because the machinery was already inside him, installed so deep he hadn't even recognized it as inherited. He closed the folder. He picked up his phone and called his attorney. "Draw up the transfer documents," Adrian said. "Full relinquishment of the inheritance clause. I'm ceding my claim to the controlling shares." The attorney, a man named Fletcher, who had served the Vale family for 15 years, took a moment before responding. "Adrian, if you do this, Dominic takes permanent control. There's no reversing it. You're walking away from a $12 billion company." "I know what I'm walking away from," Adrian said. "Get it done today." He signed the documents that afternoon. No press conference, no dramatic gesture. Just a signature on a legal form in a quiet office, the mirror image of the contract he had slid across a table to a waitress in a private dining room months ago. Except this time, he was the one giving something up. The next morning, he drove to Brooklyn. He didn't know exactly where Naomi was staying. She had gone back to the old neighborhood. He knew that much from the hospital, where Ruth's records still listed the original apartment address as the emergency contact. He drove there himself. No driver, no security. Just a man in a coat that cost more than the building's monthly rent, standing on a cracked sidewalk at 8 in the morning, looking up at a window on the 3rd floor. Naomi opened the door in a sweatshirt and jeans, her hair pulled back, no makeup, no armor. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Behind her, the apartment was small and clean, and exactly as it had always been, the narrow kitchen, the recliner by the window, the fluorescent light above the sink that still flickered. She didn't invite him in. She stood in the doorway with one hand on the frame, her body blocking the entrance to the only space in the world that had ever truly belonged to her. "I didn't bring a contract," Adrian said. He stood on the other side of the threshold with his hands at his sides, empty. "I didn't bring lawyers. I gave up the inheritance clause yesterday. Dominic has the company. I'm not here to negotiate." Naomi's expression didn't change. She had spent too many months reading his calculated gestures to be moved by declarations. "Then why are you here?" she asked. "To tell you that you were right," Adrian said, "about everything. I treated you like a solution to a problem. I looked at your life and saw an opportunity. I told myself it was a fair exchange because the numbers balanced, and I ignored every part of it that couldn't be measured." He held her gaze, and for the first time there was nothing behind his eyes except the raw discomfort of a man who had never learned how to be vulnerable and was doing it badly. "I'm sorry. That's all I came to say." Naomi studied him the way she had studied him that first night in the private dining room, directly, without flinching, without looking away. But something was different now. The man standing in her doorway was not the man who had sat across from her with a folder and a pen and the cold certainty that everyone had a price. That man had been armored. This one was not. "If I wasn't pregnant," Naomi said, "would you be standing here?" Adrian looked at the floor, then back at her. "I don't know," he said. "I want to say yes, but I spent my whole life lying to get what I wanted, and I don't want to start this by doing the same thing." Something shifted in his voice, not rehearsed, not strategic, just honest in the clumsy way that honesty sounds when a person isn't used to it. "What I do know is that I don't want to live the way I've been living, and I don't want to be the man in that folder." It wasn't a perfect answer. It wasn't the sweeping declaration that movies are made of. But it was the first thing Adrian Vale had ever said to her that she believed completely. She didn't invite him in that day. She told him she needed time, and he left without arguing. It was the first time he had ever walked away from something he wanted, without trying to control the outcome. 2 days later, Adrian held a press conference. He stood behind a podium in a conference room with no Vale Industries logo on the wall behind him, wearing a suit but no tie, and spoke to a room full of reporters who had come expecting blood. "The stories about my marriage are partially true," he said. "I approached Naomi Carter with a proposal that was transactional in nature. She did not seek me out. She did not scheme or manipulate her way into my life. I identified her, I leveraged her family's financial hardship, and I presented her with an arrangement that was designed to serve my interests." He looked directly into the cameras. "Every decision in this situation was mine. Every mistake was mine. And the woman who has been dragged through the press for the last several weeks deserves none of the blame she has received." He took no questions. He walked off the stage and didn't look back. That evening, Naomi's phone rang. It was Ruth. "I saw the news," her mother said. Her voice carried the particular weight of a woman who had spent 61 years learning how to read people and had just watched a man do something she hadn't expected. That man stood up on television and told the whole world he was wrong. "He did," Naomi said. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "If he ever makes my daughter cry again, I won't need a new kidney to find the strength to throw him out of this apartment. You tell him that." Naomi almost smiled. "I'll tell him." "And Naomi, call the hospital. Tell them I'll do the transplant." It was not forgiveness, not exactly. It was Ruth Carter doing what she had always done, making a decision with her eyes open on her own terms, because no one else was going to make it for her. Her daughter had inherited that from her. Maybe Adrian was finally starting to understand where it came from. Naomi gave Adrian one chance. Not because of the press conference, not because of the money he had walked away from. She gave him a chance because when she had asked him a question designed to expose the last lie he might be hiding, he had answered with the truth, even though the truth made him look worse. She had never met a powerful man willing to do that. It wouldn't be easy. Trust was not something that could be signed into existence on a dotted line. But Naomi had spent her entire life building things out of nothing: stability, out of chaos, dignity, out of disrespect, hope, out of hospital bills and flickering lights and $2 subway rides at midnight. If anyone knew how to build something real from broken materials, it was her. 1 year later, a small office opened on Fulton Street in Brooklyn. The sign above the door read, "Carter Women's Resource Center." It offered legal aid, job training, and financial counseling for women in low-income service jobs. The funding came from a private foundation registered under Naomi's name, not the Vale Family Trust, not corporate money, not charity with strings attached. It was hers. Ruth volunteered at the front desk 3 days a week, her transplant 6 months behind her and her voice as sharp as ever. She greeted every woman who walked through the door with the same words: "Sit down, tell me what you need, and don't leave anything out." Adrian worked in the back office most afternoons, reviewing budgets and grant applications, doing the kind of quiet, unglamorous work that no one would ever write a headline about. He was not the CEO anymore. He was not the billionaire in the corner booth. He was a man learning slowly and imperfectly how to exist in a room without controlling it. Their daughter was born in March, 7 pounds 4 ounces, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn jaw. They named her after no one. She was not a legacy. She was not an heir. She was not a clause in a contract or a line item in a will. She was wanted, simply completely wanted. And that made all the difference.